Welcome to another edition of Mailbag. Remember, these are comments and questions that you guys leave on my channel that I do my humble best to try and answer, offer comment, or just throw out to the wider community for somebody out there to help you out. As with a number of recent mailbags, I'm doing one header and then the mailbags will follow. So if you sort of read the next mailbag and it looks the same as this, that's the reason why. But before we get going, we must address the normal parish notices, which are, if you haven't subscribed to the channel and you like videos about this sort of stuff, this sort of stuff, and this sort of stuff, you need to hit the subscribe icon. Save time, hit the bell icon as well. You'll be notified when videos hit the channel. If you like the contents of this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm. And also, I highly encourage you to leave comments down below. I do read them. I respond to every single comment. And sometimes I even use those comments as subject of videos that I will film in the future. And finally, down there is the TMTG community. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, which I think is a real bargain, you can support the production of videos on the channel. Down there are also the Instagram and Facebook tags where other stuff related to the channel will appear. But now, back to the video. This next one comes from John Berg Anderson. And it's in response to Do It All and Do It Well. Would you buy a Montage Phantom over a Kronos? It was a two-part rant I did back in June 2020. And John writes, no workstations before the M1. There was the Fairlight, the Synclavier and the Ensoniq SQ1. And he's got a point. But he does raise a good point regarding the Synclavier and the Fairlight as to how would you classify them in terms of a workstation. They came into being pretty much as top-end samplers and sound manipulation devices. In actual fact, I haven't put this in the reply, there is a great piece running on YouTube at the moment by a guy called Chris, and it's I'm Building a Fairlight. So go onto YouTube and search for Building a Fairlight, because this guy is basically building a CMI, which is kind of what this was. The Fairlight CMI, which stands for Computer Musical Interface, of course. But he is actually building or rebuilding a Fairlight. He is completely bonkers, but it is actually very, very interesting watching. Anyway, I digress. And if I remember, I'll put the link to his channel down below here so you can go over and look. But you know, where do these classify in? And the other thing about these devices, they had a massive, really hefty price tag. I've read in places over the years that the base systems were about $20,000, that's US. But by the time you actually made it, added in all the bits that you needed for additional CPUs, memories, sampling boards, you were talking about $100,000 for a loaded CMI and Synclavier, and you could be talking quite easily $250,000 by the time you had the whole thing set up the way you wanted to go. And remember, these were around in the early 80s. Okay, these Fairlight machines and the Synclaviers. But these systems were these systems really a workstation? I'm not sure they were a workstation. They kind of had some sequencing capabilities, but again, that was only if you bought the cards. And then when you bought the cards, it didn't necessarily mean that you actually had all the ability you wanted. They're not workstations as we would classify the current workstation, which kind of takes its lineage from the M1 in terms of things like price point and capability. You know, there's a vast difference between the M1 that came into being in 1990 at around $2,500 to one of these Synclavier or Fairlight systems that came into being in the early 80s. 1984, I think, was the Fairlight. I'm not sure about Synclavier, where you would be dropping $250,000. There's quite a big difference there, 100-fold in terms of price. And that's kind of what I was alluding to in the video. I actually got to play with a Fairlight many years ago. I have to be honest, I have actually played with one, but I couldn't tell you what version it was, what cards were installed, and that kind of was the characteristics of a Fairlight. Every Fairlight was different. You didn't have one Fairlight was the same, because the customer chose what they wanted in the Fairlight to make it work. So they chose how much memory, what type of cards they wanted, how they wanted it to boot. You know, there was lots of stuff here. But I can remember playing the tones, shaping to produce sounds. But on this particular box that I played with, there was no sequencing; it was just non-existent. And you know, as I said, you needed to add in additional cards to do everything. So everything was an additional card. Everything was an optional extra. It was like, how do I put it in the car world, for argument's sake? You can buy a VW, okay, which is kind of what I used to have. I used to have a VW, and my top of the range VW had everything in it that you wanted, everything you needed. It had the wheels, it had the sat nav, it had the lock-in systems, it had the Bluetooth, the entertainment system. Right, I got all that for the price of my VW. If I went and looked at the equivalent Audi, half the stuff would be missing and it would be an optional extra. But that's what you get for being, and effectively it's the same damn car. So this is kind of how I would put it with the sort of the Synclavier and the Fairlight. Now, a lot of I've got to be honest and say, a lot of people around this time were playing around with Amigas and Atari STs, and you know, the MIDI programming on the Atari ST and the Amiga for a few $1,000s probably was probably more cost efficient than actually building your Fairlight with a sequencer in it. But you know, I've no idea how to compare everything. Anyway, the point was the MX1 had all these capabilities, and it was also the reason why the MX1 is the most sold synth ever. You know, in terms of number of units made and shipped, the M1 is out there by a long mile. Now, what comes really interesting, I kind of got this a bit wrong actually, but the Ensoniq range was really interesting. I thought that John was actually talking about the SQ1, and I kind of went off on one about how the SQ1 was based on the VFX, which was probably a better synth than the SQ1, to be honest. And the VFX SD made a good workstation. But the problem with Ensoniq machines is that they were notorious, or these particular machines were notorious for mechanical breakdown, specifically in the keyboard. So I kind of went off on this journey with John about this, and actually he then pointed out that he was talking about the ESQ1, not the SQ1, which kind of I misunderstood. And the ESQ1 came out mid to late 80s, and it did have a number of these features that could be found on the M1. The problem, well, I think the issue was it didn't sound as good as the M1, and it was very much more clunky to use than the M1. But people loved it. People really did like the ESQ1, and it's one of the reasons why I actually have an EPS 16, because loads of people told me to get one. I did get one, but the actual range of support for the Ensoniq equipment has staggered me. It really has. There is far more sound libraries, as far as I can see, for the Ensoniq stuff available than there was for the other manufacturers. So it definitely had a solid base. The ASR10, the EPS have a lot of material floating around on the internet, and I actually cleared up in here a couple of days ago, and I had literally a shelf behind me of Ensoniq EPS 16 discs that I need to test on my EPS 16 that I have acquired over the last X number of months. So I do apologise in my terminology. I still think that the workstations before the M1 were interesting, and I say that because another workstation that probably is worth mentioning that was around before the M1 was the D20, and a lot of people discount the lower range D models in the D lineage, but in actual fact, in some ways, the D20 was a better synth, was a better keyboard. I'll rephrase it. Was a better keyboard than the D50. And there is a piece coming to camera where I talk about this more. But if you think about what the D20 could do and what the D50 could do, the D20 was more capable, but maybe not more sonically capable. And I'll leave it at that.